Okay, so here we are now. I'm just finished. We're going to wrap this up. I'll just go over what I did. The last time I stopped, I was having a heck of a time getting the stator to line up in its position, so that the poles weren't rubbing, or at least one or two of the poles weren't rubbing on the rotor. And I messed with that and messed with that, and I just couldn't quite get it. I could get like 4 of the poles with a gap, but 2 of them would be touching no matter which way I turned it. There is room to turn it, like kind of turn it this way, and a little bit of movement up and down, but not enough. So I think what happens is when you put the inner primary case back on, there's just a little bit of movement this way and that. It's pretty firm around the engine. There's not a lot of room, and I checked that. You can see the gap. It isn't that it slides, but it will turn around there a little bit because there's still the bolts that come through, and they only have a little bit of room. I adjusted this inner case when I put it on so that the main shaft coming out of the gearbox was in the center of the oil seal, because I didn't want the oil seal offset. I wanted it to work properly. And I think that might have been the problem. I think maybe when I took it off originally, the old seal was not centered as well as I centered it. So I centered it pretty well, tightened everything up, and then I ended up with this problem where I couldn't get a couple of the poles to provide me with a gap. So I did take off the stator, and I was able to access those 3 bolts that hold the case on. Those 14 millimeter nuts, those 14 millimeter nuts that are on the studs that go through the case from the engine. And I kind of just tapped it with my rubber mallet, trying to shift it a little bit this way, but I didn't want to go nuts on it. Again, I wanted to keep the oil seal centered from the main shaft from the gearbox. So I tightened them back up, I put them back in position, I had a look. Still not quite where I wanted. It was close, but there was still a couple of poles that were touching the rotor. So I messed with it and messed with it. I tightened it a little bit. I tightened them where they weren't super tight, but enough that they were just starting to snug up. And then I would tap in different places with my rubber mallet on the stator, trying to shift it a little this way, a little that way, and I just couldn't get it. So I gave up. I took off the stator. I took the nuts off. I removed the stator, pulled the cable out, and I just went at it with a burr, with a steel burr, and I just widened the holes. I just widened them, and I figured out which way it needed to go. It needed to go down towards the 4 or 5 o'clock position. So up here around the 10, 11 o'clock position on the holes, I just widened them out a little bit on all 3 holes through the armature here. And I did that 3 times, but that was just because I kept checking to see if it was there or not there. I took it out. I didn't want to take a whole lot of meat off. So I just took my time, and it took me 3 steps, but I finally did get it, where it was really, really close, and I could see I had good gaps. So then what I did was I put the nuts and the washers and then the nuts back on, and just started to snug them up a little bit, not super tight. And then I just came at it with the rubber mallet and just gently tapped here and there to shift it a little bit, and it worked out fine. And then I tightened all 3, and I put my 1-inch socket on here. I took the spark plug out of the engine so that it made it a little easier to turn from this side. I didn't have to try to get the decompressor release with one hand and the socket with the other. So I put the socket on, and I just slowly turned this and listened for scraping, and there was no scraping. And I got down quickly, and I looked, and I could see a gap all the way around off of all 6 poles. So it was good. So tightened everything up nice and tight. I adjusted the chain, the primary chain here. The manual says 1/4 inch or about 7 millimeters. So I just adjusted it out to that, tightened it up, and then I set the lock nut down below. I put my O-ring back in, and years ago, actually way back in the 90s, the first time I changed the primary oil out, I changed oil out for ATF, because I used to have a problem with this clutch slipping with just oil in there. So I went to ATF, and especially the F-rated ATF, and that worked really well. I never had any more clutch slippage. Anyway, when I took that out, I found that this O-ring had swelled a bit, and I couldn't get it back in, so I ended up having to cut it and I had cut a little bit off. Well, it was funny because this time, same thing. I went to put the O-ring back in, which is now really just a long piece of rubber because I'd snipped it years ago. And same thing. It seems that it swelled up a little bit and it was longer. I had to cut off about, I don't know, a good friggin' 8 centimeters anyway off of the thing, but I did, 6 or 8 centimeters. I cut it off, and you can see it fits perfectly. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that little extra piece and start looking around at some of the jobbers and see if I can find some of this material here, this rubber material, the same diameter, and I might buy some. It's becoming difficult to get online. A lot of the parts for this bike, which used to be very easy to get online, are now becoming scarcer and scarcer. You're starting to see a lot for the bullets made in the 2000s, after 2002. And you're not really starting to see a lot of the ones that were made from 1990 to 2002, which is this model, really. Anyway, so now the next step is got everything tightened here. The nut for the rotor's tightened to 40 foot-pounds. That's locked. Chain is adjusted properly. These are all 3 tightened down, snug. The clutch works fine. See, a little stiff, but then I think it'll free up a little bit once I get some fluid in there, some oil in there. And going to put the cover back on, the outer cover, and then fill it up with some automatic transmission fluid. I think it was around 400 or somewhere between 400 and 450 milliliters of oil goes into this thing. But really all you do is you just, on the outer cover, there's the one screw on the bottom here that's really your level. You take the screw out and you just fill it up until it just starts to weep out the threads, and you know you're at the right level, that the chain will pick it up and the clutch and the oil will get thrown around. So that's the next thing. Do that. I have brand new gear oil in the gearbox, and it hasn't leaked yet. So the real test will be once I run the bike, go for a spin, and come back and see if it's leaking. But I doubt very much if it will get past those 2 new sealed bearings. And while I was doing all this, I just popped open the oil, drained the oil out of the engine, took out the old filter. I'm just going to clean out. I always clean out that cavity that the filter goes in. Going to throw a new filter in, throw that back together, and top it up with some 10W40, throw a battery in and some gasoline, and should be ready to give it a try and see if all this effort worked out. I think I've got everything back together and no extra parts, which is always a big plus, right? Anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for playing along as I made all kinds of mistakes and figured things out and worked stuff out, but we'll see where it's going. I think the next thing I'll do is I'll make a video of the bike stationary up on a stand with going through the gears. I think just me going through the gears to see that the thing works, and we'll throw that one up. But for now, thanks for watching.